All right. So the 1920s. This is my other area where I think they may choose to go with a DBQ. And a number of reasons why I have that feeling. Progressives, they haven't really asked a question about progressives as a Form A question since the 1980s. They asked progressives as a Form B question in 2003. The 1920s, they've never asked a question. How can you skip an entire decade? They've never asked a question on the 1920s. So, believe it, since the last time they asked a DBQ from the first half of the 20th century was 2003, and that was the New Deal. I'm thinking that could be the 1920s. Okay. Now, I don't know what it would be on. Would it be on the economy of the 1920s? Would it be on the Harlem Renaissance? Would it be on the 1920s as a period of conservatism? Would it be on the 1920s as a period of modernity? Would it be on foreign policy of the 1920s, which I'll talk about when we get to World War II? But I tend to keep coming back to this question. I try to think like AP test makers. What could I ask? And when I look at the 1920s, the thing that strikes me about the 1920s is that it seems to be going in two different directions at once. There are people that seem to be embracing the idea of modernity and change and newness and technology and changing social values and changing cultural values. And then there seem to be the folks who are reacting against it. The traditionalists, the conservatives, the people who are afraid of too much change. And so the question I came up with is analyze how the 1920s represents a clash between modernity and traditional values. I think that would be an outstanding question because it gets you to think about the 1920s through two different lenses. So what we're going to take a look at, and I've got the topic on each of the slides here, the 1920s as a decade of clashing values. Be looking for where the clash is. Okay? Be thinking about what's clashing. What's when you're talking about a clash, you're at odds. One side believes this, one side believes that. Okay? So, in terms of politics in the 1920s, it is an era dominated by conservative Republican presidents. So politically, it tends to be a throwback, very traditional, a rejection of progressivism, okay? Where progressives believed in regulating the economy, regulating banking, regulating business, regulating labor. These Republican presidents go the opposite direction. They are pro-business. They deregulate business. They deregulate banking. They deregulate industry. They believe in tax cuts for the rich and trickle-down economics. Now, guys, these Republicans are very much like the Republicans you have today in that respect. The fiscal Republicans, the conservative fiscal Republicans that believe in balanced budgets and not spending too much and giving tax cuts to the wealthiest Americans, with the belief, like Hamilton, that if you provide tax benefits to the people at the top, the idea is that they will take that money and invest it in their business. They will expand their business, hire more people get a paycheck, More people have money to spend. If you expand your business, you build onto your business. It hires construction workers. Heck, you even have to hire a janitor for the new annex you built onto your factory. That's the belief of trickle-down economics. And we have had, throughout our history, experiments with that idea. Hamilton believed it. These guys believe it. Kennedy, John Kennedy believed it. Ronald Reagan preached it. I mean, it was like gospel to Reagan. Tax cuts. He went so far to call it Reagan in the 1980s, called Reaganomics. Tax cuts for the wealthy, trickle down. Some poor people, I think, thought they were getting trickled on. And then George W. Bush did it in 2001. $1.2 trillion tax cut. George W. Bush was left with a budget surplus, 3 years of budget surpluses. And at the end of his presidency, wound up with an $8 trillion debt. Because you cut the taxes, you cut the revenue to the government, but you didn't cut the spending. And that tends to be the problem. You cut the taxes, but you don't cut the spending. So you wind up with a deficit. It's economics 101. Anyway, deregulation, tax cuts for the rich, limiting labor unions, and opposition to the League of Nations. That tended to define Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. Now, that doesn't mean that there wasn't any kind of progressive legislation. It doesn't mean that America, withdrew into its shell like a frightened turtle. It just means that America is not going to be using its government in a way that you saw with big stick diplomacy and dollar diplomacy and, factory regulations and, progressive income taxes. We'll start with Harding. He's the more interesting of the three Republican presidents from the 20s. He sought to end progressive legislation. Now, the tax cuts that were enacted under Harding were the brainchild not of Harding, but of his Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon. Now, Mellon was the Secretary of Treasury not only for Harding, but for Coolidge and for Hoover. He was the Secretary of Treasury for 12 years. Why was he Secretary of Treasury? Because he was a billionaire. Because he was a banker. That's where he made his millions. Billions. Anybody recognize the name Mellon? Yeah. Carnegie Mellon. There you go. There's a reason why the guy's name is on the college. There you are. So the tax cuts are enacted by Mellon, believing that if you cut the taxes for the wealthiest people in America, that it will expand the pie for everybody. And the wealthy keep their money. The Ford-Niebuhr tariff. A resumption of high tariffs like you saw during the Gilded Age. Yes, you had a brief respite with Wilson and the Underwood tariff, but now you go back to high protective tariffs to keep foreign goods out and protect American businesses and jobs. What's the problem with high tariffs? Yeah.
The farmers need supplies.
How does farmers needing supplies relate to high tariffs? I don't know what that means.
They can't make as much money as they were with the low tariffs because they can't sell to other markets.
There you go. The markets for farmers are cut off. The markets for American goods are cut off. American industrial goods. They're not selling their markets. They're not selling their goods overseas in foreign markets either. You wind up with tariff wars. And so this high protective tariff is put in place. Deregulation of industry. All that progressive legislation that had been passed by Roosevelt, to a lesser extent by Taft, and definitely by Wilson. All of that is going to be stripped away through something called the Esch-Cummins Act. I've never seen Esch-Cummins on a test, never seen it. But I have seen deregulation of industry. They just don't call it the Esch-Cummins Act. But there was like this act, and the purpose of the act was to strip progressive legislation that regulated businesses. But the thing that most people remember about Warren Harding is that his administration was corrupt and inept. The Teapot Dome scandal. Had Warren Harding not died in 1923, he probably would have been impeached and possibly removed from office. Harding he was a not ready for primetime player. He was a compromise candidate. He was a dark horse candidate for the Republicans. A lot of people call him a smoke-filled room candidate where the guys got together smoking cigars, drinking brandy, and saying, all right, who do you want as the Republican nominee? And that's pretty much how he was decided, in a back room. He had been a one-term senator from Ohio. He was not very smart. I believe I read you the quote from Harding. I am not fit for this office and should never have been elected here. Here's some more Harding self-reflection. This guy just beat himself up. I am a man of limited talents. I don't seem to grasp that I am president. I don't know anything about this European stuff, and I can't make a damn thing out of this tax issue. That's the guy running the country. What was Harding best known for? He was best known for playing poker, for being a good old boy, for surrounding himself with his buddies from Ohio, what they called the Ohio Gang. These were all his friends from Ohio, mainly his poker buddies. And they were the ones that were running the various departments in the federal government. Oftentimes, Harding, and keep in mind, Prohibition had just passed, so alcohol was illegal as of 1920. Every Tuesday night, Harding would have an alcohol-soaked poker game at the White House. It would be the equivalent today of Obama breaking out an 8-ball and having a kegger over at the White House, all right? Yeah. So Harding's having poker games, drinking the booze. He gambled away a set of White House china, had an affair with a 13-year-old girl named Nan Britton. She wound up getting pregnant. Wonder how that happened. In a broom closet, no less. He was just as revolting a human being as you could think of. And inept. He got elected because he said, I want to return us to normalcy. And the American people buy that stuff. Guys, we have elected people who are completely inept. Like him. And it's fine. The country survives. It's all good. We'll get to the next guy or girl. So, Harding had the good sense to die in 1923 of a stroke. Although, again, I would recommend you look up Florence Harding and look up the conspiracy surrounding her. And Florence knew that, Warren was screwing around on her. And a lot of people think there's this conspiracy that she had him bumped off because she did not allow an autopsy. I mean, can you imagine that? President dies and you're not allowed to have an autopsy? Wouldn't see that today. But this Teapot Dome scandal, what in the world is a Teapot Dome? It's a place in Wyoming. It was an oil reserve in Wyoming that the federal government had set aside during the Progressive Era as land to be preserved. The Secretary of the Interior, remember the Ohio gang, a guy named Albert Fall, was using his office to make money by leasing the federal land for oil drilling to the Mammoth Oil Company, who, by the way, is still around. I see their trucks every now and then. Mammoth Oil. They were allowed to drill on land that had been set aside, and Fall was taking bribes for it. Now, there were a number of other scandals. The Veterans Department was involved in scandal. The Bureau of Indian Affairs was involved in scandal. But everything kind of gets lumped under Teapot Dome. Kind of like with Watergate and Nixon. The Watergate scandal is more than just five guys breaking into a hotel room in D.C., okay? There were like 30-some scandals associated with the Nixon administration that all get lumped under Watergate. So everything gets lumped under Teapot Dome. And I love the quote from Warren Harding. He said, "It's not my enemies that worry me, it's my friends that keep me pacing the floor at night." So he knew the kind of unsavory people he was surrounding himself with. Now, when he dies, he is succeeded by his very dour, I mean, that's the best way to describe him. I mean, look at him throwing the pitch out here at a baseball game. Dour Calvin Coolidge. Where Calvin Coolidge was a party guy, good time guy, Calvin Coolidge is the opposite. He is as straight-laced and puritanical as you get. Now, he had been nominated for vice president because he had been the governor of Massachusetts at the time when the Boston Police Department went on strike, and he called out the Massachusetts National Guard to put the strike down. So he was seen as a law and order governor. So that's why he got nominated. And so when he becomes president, he's known really for doing nothing. There's really nothing that is done during the Coolidge administration. I mean, I think the thing that most people remember about Calvin Coolidge is he didn't talk. His nickname was Silent Cal. He didn't say anything. I mean, there was a lady at a dinner party one time, and she leaned over to the president, one of these, saucy smokers and drinkers, leans over to the president and says, "Mr. President, I bet I could get you to say more than 2 words." And without missing a beat, didn't even look up, said, "Yeah." And here's the thing. Coolidge really didn't need to do anything because the economy was booming in the 1920s. And a lot of that came from the pent-up demand from the end of World War I. People had been working overtime, double time, triple time, time and a half, had all this money in their pocket, and were ready to spend it. And so once the factories were making domestic goods again in the 1920s, people were spending money on anything and everything they could find. Most houses were wired for electricity. Most houses had indoor plumbing. Most people could afford a car. So in the 1920s, all that pent-up demand for products is going to drive the economy of the 20s. Coolidge doesn't need to do anything. Just get out of the way. Farmers do not succeed during the 1920s. They overproduce, they underperform, and because of the high tariffs, can't sell their goods overseas. They ask the Congress for help. And it's called the McNary-Haugen Farm Aid Bill. What the McNary-Haugen Bill would have done is it would have provided farm subsidies. It would have provided farm subsidies to farmers who were bad off. So if they expected to make this much and they made this much, the farmers were asking for Congress to close the gap.
Morning, Senate. Your morning announcement will be on shortly.
Coolidge vetoed the bill twice. And the American people loved it. Coolidge became president in 1923, served out the rest of Harding's term, ran for a term in his own right, and won convincingly. Look at poor old Bob La Follette. That'll tell you how much people like progressivism in the 1920s. He wins friggin' Wisconsin, and that's it. And who the hell's John W. Davis? I have no idea. No clue. I'd never even heard of the guy. So that's where the Democrats are and the progressives are in the 1920s. And when we come back next time, we'll cover what else we can.